Thank you, Chair. Minister, unfortunately, you probably can preempt what I'm going to say on the matter, but I think the reality is I want to thank the people before profit for bringing the motion. It is a very important talking point and very concerning to most people. But the question really is, why do we need an eviction ban? We need an eviction ban simply because government has failed to provide adequate housing. They have failed to acknowledge and deal with the root cause of the failure being poor planning policy. And before I move on, I want to reiterate what my colleague Deputy Canning has said in relation to landlords. Well, the same goes for developers. But when we talk about landlords and we look at the RTB in its current form has been described to me by constituents as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. We have a situation where we live in an IT world, and we have the RTB informing landlords that what they need to do, because they won't or can't accept their email address, the RTB refers them back to a paper application and a money postal order. Now, Minister, I would ask you to address that situation, and if you need to call the head of the RTB in and sit down and have a conversation, I'd ask you to do it now. Ultimately, the RTB is a mediator between the landlord and the tenant. It's only working for the tenant at this point in time. So when that's addressed, I'm going to move on now to planning policy. Do you know, Minister, it takes 20 weeks to build a 3-bed semi-detached house? 20 weeks. How could we have a problem with housing if it only takes 20 weeks to build a 3-bed house? We have a problem with planning policy, because in order to be granted the planning permission for any sizable development, it takes 104 weeks, 2 years to go through the policy. Now, that's if it's straightforward and there's no objections. If it goes to An Bord Pleanála, it takes 182 weeks. And that can be further tempered by judicial review proceedings. And yet, in the 10 years that Fine Gael are in government, nobody has attempted to change the planning policy at root level. It's the high-density measure that I talk about all the time that does not fit rural Ireland. We come back to that. I spoke to you about that only last week. I've been hearing about new guidelines. I've been hearing about ministerial orders. I haven't received anything. Neither have any of the local authorities. So at those timelines, we have developers who have applied for planning 3 years ago, being granted permissions today. And what's the problem today? Viability. How can you possibly build affordable housing when what ensued since they applied has been, number one, a pandemic, number two, Brexit, and number three, we're in the midst of a war. And we're talking about housing. We're not talking about affordable housing. All of the commencement is within social housing, or those who can afford to buy an exorbitant, lovely family home with a front and back garden that's probably 4 to 5 beds. But the people falling between two stools are those who are actually working hard but will never own their own home. We have 11,632 people homeless, and those figures are very, very debatable, given that we have 4,500 people within the direct provision system who are now citizens of this country and don't belong there, but they can't find accommodation, so they're stuck within the system. Minister, this is not rocket science. 20 weeks to build a 3-bed house. You know what the problem is. The government knows what the problem is. The reluctance is the will to do something about it. Thank you.